thank you all for coming this evening. There's always an opportunity cost, and it's been a good day, so I'm sure some people were tempted to do something more entertaining than listening to me. Let me just clarify a couple of things that Paul has said. I originally called this book Rentier Capitalism. And when I finished writing it, the publisher said, Guy, you can't call a book Rentier Capitalism. Nobody will understand what that means, and you'll get no readers. And he read the book, and well, basically, it's about corruption of capitalism. And I said, I'm sorry, it's an oxymoron. Capitalism is corrupt, okay, by its very nature. So he said, but that's what it's basically about. So eventually I said to myself, well, look, actually, it's not bad, because what the book is about is that the claims of the right are fundamentally a bunch of lies. The claim for the economic system is quite different from what it is. And it is a corruption of the language, and it is involving systemic corruption. And it's ironic that the book's coming out this week, the very week when we've seen the European Super League, which is a form of rentier capitalism. We've seen the Cameron shenanigans going from one absurdity to another. There's a whole chapter on the corruption of democracy and how revolving doors and these various political characters are figuring in completely destroying any possible nature of free market economy. The second thing, Paul, that Massive Attack, I'm told, is one of the most iconic musical groups in the country. And they have a huge fan base internationally. And they asked me to do this short video with me talking, and they put music and nice graphics and things. And since it was put up on YouTube in last summer, I happened to be asked the other day, do you know how many times it's been viewed? And it's already been viewed more than 400,000 times in English and hundreds of thousands of times in Spanish, Italian, German, and French. So I think it's a very good medium to get out your messages if you get an opportunity, which of course doesn't come to someone like me more than once in a lifetime. So that's the background. And it gets me dozens of emails every day from people who say, right on, because it is a bit radical, but I stand by every word in it. Now, what I want to talk about as briefly as I can is that we are in a moment of crisis in the global transformation. Some of you may be familiar with Karl Polanyi's great book written in 1944 called The Great Transformation. And in his book, he basically said that there was a period when it was dominated by finance, which created so much inequality and insecurity, it led to the threat of the annihilation of civilization and either fascism or Bolshevism. And his book was very influential, but my view is that his great transformation with the welfare state capitalism broke down in the 1970s. And Thatcher and Reagan basically began what every economist called ever since neoliberal economics revolution, the Chicago School, the Mont Pelerin Society, which I briefly discussed, which was a radical right economics revolution. And they basically claimed that what they wanted to do was create a free market system based on privatization, individualization, and financial liberalization. That was the late 70s, the early 80s. All of us here will know all about that. And what I'm arguing from the outset is we are no longer in a neoliberal age. Neoliberalism ended basically in the 1990s. It had done its job. And what has happened since is this rentier capitalism. And briefly what this means is that more and more of the income and wealth and power go to the owners of property. Property rights triumph over market principles. It's a rigged system. And the system is based on this huge lie that they talk about free markets when actually they know very well it's the most unfree market system ever constructed. That's the contextual theme behind the writing of this book. Now, rentier capitalism takes various dimensions, but I want to go through very briefly. You can ask for clarification or look at the book if you're interested on these issues. The first thing that happened was financialization. Financialized liberalization, the big bang of 1980s, meant that finance suddenly had awesome power over productive capital. And it's got to the point where the value of financial assets in Britain is over 1,000% of GDP, over 1,000% of national income. It happens to be double what it is in the United States, but in all countries, the financial assets have risen enormously in value compared with every other piece of capital. And if you think about it, financial assets are 5 times as great today as they were at the end of the 1990s. They've just become awesomely powerful. And with the independent monetary policy by the Bank of England and by other central banks, what the successive crises that have happened has allowed the central banks to pour more and more money into the financial sector. We all know that story in the sense that it has flooded and enormously increased their incomes and wealth. And new financial institutions have become more and more powerful. Over 3,400 companies in Britain today are owned by private equity funds, foreign private equity funds. And in the process, huge influence and power has gone to the major financial institutions, above all, Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachsism, as I describe in the book, it is a revolving door in which many of the top politicians, the governors of the central banks, have spent years in Goldman Sachs and then come into political position. Sunak was apprenticed and was taught his basic economics. He doesn't know a lot, basic economics by a period in his youth in Goldman Sachs. And then he went to work for hedge funds out of tax havens and made his vast fortune. But he's not alone. A whole variety of people have been doing that. Now, as finance has become more and more the power of the system, what we've seen is that finance has been able to increase conglomeration of corporations. So that we've seen that the technological revolution that's been taking place, the old neoliberal agenda with flexible labor markets and so on, has resulted in enormous increase in concentration of corporations. So over 3/4 of all industries have become more concentrated in a handful of powerful corporations, and that's an international phenomenon. And one consequence is that the markup of prices over costs of production have gone up incredibly. So for example, if you take a firm today in its costs of producing is marked up by 60%. It used to be marked up by 10% or whatever. But today now it's vastly increased. And what this means is the rental incomes that those companies get has been going up and up. But I go back then to the next big lie that has been told by advocates of free markets. The big development occurred in the 1990s, 1994 in particular, very close to where I'm sitting this evening. Chief executive of Pfizer, the company that's producing one of the vaccines, got together with a group of big CEOs of the United States, big pharmaceutical companies, big financial companies, and they forged what's called TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. And what TRIPS did was it globalized the US private property, intellectual property rights system. Before 1995, each year, fewer than 1 million patents were filed each year. This past year, and not for the first time, over many years now, over 3 million patents are filed, and over 15 million patents are in force as we sit here. What that means, in plain English, is that it gives, each patent gives the holder of the patent a monopoly profit for 20 years. Nobody else is allowed to produce what they patent or the process, use the process that they patent. And patent income now comes to about 1/5 of global GDP. Huge rent. This is not a free market. This is monopolization, institutionalized by a device. So copyright as well, which used to be 14 years, now is 70 years for the whole of your life. And for 70 years afterwards, in many cases. This is pure monopoly. And we've seen this leading to what's called hoovering. We all know what hoovering means, but the big tech companies, the big finance companies, the big pharmaceutical companies, what they do is they go and buy up the patents from various people. They may come and offer you something for inventing something in your garage, and they string them together and turn the potential income from one patent to the point where many of the biggest corporations have 20,000 patents, which they string together and make billions and billions from that process. And what is really scandalous is that while the lie is told that you need to encourage innovations and things, and therefore it's a reward for innovations, most patents are the result of publicly funded research and development. So the corporations don't take the risks, you and I take the risks. And that's the case with the vaccines, all sorts of other things that have been taking place. We take the risk. And many of the patents are taken out not to get production, but to stop anybody producing it because that product might be competitive with another product the corporation is wanting to sell us. It's a scandalous situation, which is entrenched further by the most undemocratic legal process imaginable. It's called the ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement. If any multinational corporation today thinks that a government's change of policy would affect their future profits, they can sue the government before the ISDS. The ISDS consists of 3 corporate lawyers, one of whom is appointed by the corporation bringing the case, the second one by the government, and the third, if they can't agree, by the president of the World Bank, who happens always to be an American. And you will be very, very surprised that the United States has never lost a case before the ISDS when it's a defendant. I wonder why. But the ISDS has resulted in numerous countries having to fork out hundreds of millions of dollars, pounds, or euros to corporations just because they changed a climate piece of regulation, or raised the minimum wage, or introduced some regulation on safety in the workplace. It's as simple as that. It's a disgrace. And it's been allowed to go on for years and years and years without being thrown away. The next aspect of rentier capitalism is what I've called the scourge of subsidies. The third lie is that subsidies are paid by governments in order to encourage certain types of production and welfare improving changes. This is a lie. Most subsidies go to the wealthy and are regressive. I've done a calculation in the book that there are 1,156 forms of tax relief in Britain today. The Treasury, conveniently, has calculated the income foregone by the Treasury of these regressive tax reliefs for the wealthy. But they can't calculate all of them, scandalously. They just calculate for the top 209. And I surprised John McDonnell by telling him one day, I said, John, the first thing I want you to do if you become Chancellor is to roll these back, because those top 209 forms of tax relief cost the Treasury £430 billion a year in lost income. They are not helping to improve production. One of the biggest, for example, goes to the Duke of Buccleuch. I love saying the Duke of Buccleuch, who happens to be the biggest landowner in Britain, who inherited 277,000 acres of prime land simply because he was the 10th descendant of an illegitimate child of Charles II. You will be delighted to know that he's getting a lot of something for nothing. He's received about £10 million in subsidies just to encourage him to look after his land. Now that's good, lovely. Why not? I'd love some of that money. We also have, for example, landlords across the country. If they spend anything on their gardening, they get a subsidy, tax relief. They don't have to pay tax on the money they spend on the gardening. Why should they get that? Why not you and I? So we've got actually thousands of possible reforms, nearly, as I say, 1,156, but there are actually other forms that I discuss in the book. And of course, many of the people who've made phenomenal amount of money are the prime politicians. David Cameron has done magnificently out of the subsidies that his father-in-law and he has received. And I document that in the book. The next aspect of rentier capitalism, and this for a Marxist or a socialist is very important, is the prime role played by debt. Debt is not an accidental issue. We have higher levels of private debt, corporate debt, and public debt than at any time in our history. But financial institutions want us to be in debt. And I quote some of them actually saying that. They want us to be in debt because that's where they make their money. And debt, of course, has been used to increase the ownership of property. A term that I don't want to scare you with, but I'm an economist, so really boring, so I have to use these words. The key word is securitization. If you have a couple of beers, you have difficulty saying it, but securitization basically means you take a bundle of debts, and you use that debt as collateral for borrowing money to invest in a speculative venture. So you make money from people's debts. George Osborne, when he was Chancellor, wrapped up student debts in a huge bundle, 80 billion worth, and then sold it to an American private equity company, which used it to make profits in and not paid British tax because they had set up in the Netherlands. So tax avoidance is part of the debt mechanism. And of course, it has been extended in the COVID period. I think one of the most scandalous things of what the government did last year during the COVID lockdown is they had this wonderful scheme for giving loans to multinational corporations. And the biggest single loan given, interest-free, went to the German chemical company, which is the biggest chemical company in the world, BASF, B-A-S-F. And BASF was lent by the British government £1 billion, even though when I looked on their books, their corporate books, their profits last year were £117 billion net. Here we have a situation where you're giving out loans to corporations when people are on the breadline and the precariat is growing daily. It should be a major scandal. The biggest billionaire steel owner, Gupta, he rejuggled his corporate empire in order to benefit from this wonderful scheme introduced by Mr. Goldman Sachs's own apprentice to benefit the corporate world. Now, the next aspect relates to what Paul said earlier in talking about it. I've written a book called Plunder of the Commons, and it makes me very angry when I think about the commons. There's a chapter in this book about the plunder of the commons, because what Thatcher started was a new phase of enclosure, encroachment, commodification, privatization of our commons. Not just our natural commons, our land, our water, our seabed, and so on, but also our social commons. I've just written a blog that basically our football clubs are part of our social commons. A social commons is an institution that was created for the community as part of the community and became a commons by tradition for 20 years after it had been established as a common. That's when it becomes, under the law, a commons. And of course, the National Health Service became a social commons in 1968, 20 years after it was established as a commons. And you can go back right the way to the Charter of the Forest of 1217 to see this tradition of building our commons. Our commons reduces inequality. The diggers, the levelers, all of those vast traditional revolts, the peasants' revolts, were all about trying to reclaim and keep our commons. But we have lost over 10% of our land since Thatcher came in. And much of it was introduced in the austerity era after 2010. We've seen a privatization of our water to financial institutions. Most of our waters now monopolized by foreign private equity. And what they do is they pay out all the profits, load the corporation with debt, which they can then use to get tax relief, and then very quickly suddenly go bankrupt or do something where they have to sell out to somebody else at a lower value and rush off with the profits. It is a scandal, but it's happening all the time. The royal estate has just been doing something even more scandalous, which I've mentioned, which is their auctioning off our seabed. Thousands of hectares of seabed have just been sold to multinationals by the royal estate, and they're making £9 billion from doing so. It's our seabed. It's your seabed. And so they're going to be building wind farms 5 times the size of Hull on seabed that has been rented out to make billions in a form of enclosure and privatization. The commons is in different ways one of the areas that we should be fighting for, and is one of the reasons why I support a basic income as a matter of common justice. We want compensation for the fact that our commons has been taken. And the last piece of my analysis is that rentier capitalism has generated a new global class structure. And this is actually where I came in on my analysis before I wanted to write this book. I wrote a book in 2011 called The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class. It's been very controversial, but a sixth edition, I think, is about to come out. It's been translated into 25 languages. And every single day, without exception, I receive emails from people who say, I'm in the precariat. And the global class structure is meaning that the precariat, as I find it, with distinctive relations of production, distinctive relations of distribution, and distinctive rights to the state, has become the new mass class. I work a lot with various people in politics. I've been urging Ed Miliband, who's a friend, I've urged Ed to say, look, if you want to have a new agenda, start with three things: dismantling rentier capitalism, an agenda for the precariat, and revival of the commons. The precariat today is split into an atavistic part, people who don't have a lot of education, but they feel they've lost yesterday, and they vote for the Boris Johnsons, the Trumps, and the other neo-fascist populists. Then the migrants in it who keep their head down, but they have days of rage, and they're prepared to look for a new progressive politics. But the group that I get invited to address all over the place, all over the world actually, is the progressive part. Those who went to college or university who come out without a future. And they're looking for a new progressive politics. And that progressive politics must include a new income distribution system. And the anchor of that system should be a basic income as an economic right of every individual. Basic income would be a modest payment out of the rentier income, out of the loss of the commons, out of the pollution through carbon tax and so on, that will be built up and give every individual modest weekly amount, monthly amount, without condition, as a right, non-withdrawable. And that would give basic security, common justice, and enhance freedom. It's not a panacea, it's an important part of the new progressive agenda. And unless we do that, we're going to see more and more anger, more and more insecurity, more and more wealth inequality, and a breakdown leading to neo-fascism, almost guaranteed. So at the moment, I'm on 3 days a week, very pessimistic. And 3 days a week, I'm bloody optimistic. 32 councils across England and Wales have voted to do basic income pilots. More are in the pipeline. 170 MPs courageously demanded one last year. The Labour leadership doesn't know yes from no, or whatever you want to say, and they don't know whether they should come out or not. I've talked to some of them, Annalise Dodds and so on. But I think that we need to put pressure because that's where the future should lie for the left. Thank you for listening. I'm quite happy to answer questions.